Hello and good evening, everyone. My name is Robbie V, and I'll be your narrator for tonight. Tonight's chilling tale is entitled The Cosmic Gargantuan by Reddit user Dinozilla626. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. There is a strong chance that I could get arrested for what I'm disclosing here, but the public deserves to know what has been discovered. I should warn you that what I'm about to tell you may completely change how you feel about life, so if you wish to maintain your sanity, then I suggest that you stop listening to this now. To limit the possibility of me getting caught out, I'm not going to disclose my name or anyone else involved in the events that have transpired. I work for NASA, and about 6 years ago, we sent 4 probes into space on course for Jupiter's moon, Europa. For those of you who don't know, Europa's surface is covered in a thick ice layer, and it's been believed for many years that beneath the ice is an ocean, and if there's an ocean, then that creates the possibility of life. The reason you've never heard about this project is because we believe that the intense publicity we would receive from the press may compromise the mission. Regulating these things takes a lot more work than you would think, so we did it in secret to save us the time of constant press interviews. The probes were taken by spacecraft, and once there they would be scattered across the 4 corners of the moon by AI-controlled miniature crafts. They would then drill a hole into the ice, and the probes would be deployed into whatever was beneath it. The probes themselves were very impressive pieces of technology. I won't go into detail about how each one was made, but they have a highly sophisticated AI control that would allow them to navigate themselves around Europa's ocean. They were also equipped with high-quality recording devices with night vision capable of showing color, microphones so that we could see and hear what they did, mechanical arms to analyze any samples we found, and were also designed to withstand 9,000 pounds of ocean pressure. After those 6 years, the probes finally arrived. We were notified about this 35 minutes later, as they were programmed to send a signal to us once they reached their destination, and it takes a while for it to reach Earth from that distance, so everything we saw on the cameras happened about half an hour beforehand. We observed each probe's journey on a split screen, kind of like a 4-player video game. Each probe waited for each other to land on Europa before the craft started drilling so that they could all start exploring what lay beneath. It took about an hour, but before long, the probes were underneath the surface. Our suspicions were indeed correct. There was in fact an ocean underneath the ice, and it seemed as though it covered the planet as all the probes were submerged in water. The ocean was expectantly dark, and even with the night vision, the probes had to activate the built-in torches so that they could get a better look of the place. Each probe started to submerge further, but it wasn't long before one discovered what we were looking for. Probe 1 was approached by a never-before-seen alien life form. The room back on Earth where this was being observed was silenced in shock, before everyone yelled a victorious cheer at the discovery that alien life did indeed exist on Europa. Needless to say, we were thrilled. The creature itself was about 6 feet long and resembled a giant silver tadpole. It had a single white glowing eye on the front of its head, with several thin tendrils around what we assumed to be its mouth. Just behind its head were 4 tentacles on each side, each slightly shorter than its tail. It was stationary, just staring at probe 1, its tentacles gently flowing with the water's movement. Before we knew it, more of these creatures had approached probes 2, 3, and 4, all staring at them with little movement. Logic dictated that they were merely investigating the probes, as they clearly had never seen anything like them before. Still, the fact that they were halted while staring in the face of these unknown creatures was a little odd. Suddenly, several other of the creatures could be seen in the background of each screen. We could see their glowing eyes moving as they swam upwards. The probes took note of this and looked upwards at what they were all swimming towards. They were gathering around the holes made in the ice. What was even more peculiar was that they seemed to start swimming around its shape. At first we thought maybe this was a primal instinct, like when you put food in a fish tank and they all swim up to get it. But then we noticed that some kind of substance was appearing around them. There was what appeared to be a white cloud formed between them as they continued to circle and dart around the point of entry. Then, they all scattered. Once the cloud disappeared, we could finally see what they were doing. The point of entry had frozen over. Of course, it was a lot thinner than what it had been, but still, it was frozen. They had actually released some kind of a chemical, which I assumed may have been liquid nitrogen, and tried to fix the hole. This raised a myriad of questions. Why would they do this? What evolutionary reason would they have to behave in such a way? Had this happened before in order for them to evolve in this way? What was also of interest was the fact that as the probes moved, the creatures that had approached them seemed to tail behind them, as if they were keeping an eye on them. The probes all submerged further, and it wasn't long before they reached the bottom. It was surprisingly shallow on each side of the planet. The bottom of this ocean was covered in what seemed to be a swamp green, furry seaweed that swayed in the water on the top of a dark surface. What was particularly interesting was that despite the difference in terrain on each side, the seaweed was the exact same. There was no variations in color or different plant species. It was all identical. Speaking of terrain, the environment the probe 1 found on the north side of Europa was nothing special. The same terrain seemed to continue for several miles and resembled what you usually find in the shallow waters of Earth. Probe 2, which was positioned on Europa's south, found that its terrain was more curved. The curve would be very difficult to notice at first, as once again it spread for miles, but it was certainly there. What's more was that in the distance, one could make out more structures, 2 to be precise. They could be seen in the form of shadows and extended into the sky, where each curved in a different position. The terrain on Probe 3's side was similar to Probe 1's, however this side had structures of its own. From a distance it could be seen in a row that there were what appeared to be large mountains in the shape of shark dorsal fins. They were all relatively the same size and shape, which was quite impressive for a structure that formed naturally. Probe 4, which was on the opposite side to Probe 3, seemed to have landed on a small mountain. We could tell this because it landed just at the edge of it, and it could be made out that beneath was more land. What was significantly different from the other sides, however, was the fact that the side had a large section that didn't have any seaweed. There was still some there, but when the probe moved along, it came to an edge of the seaweed, where for miles stretched out was a piece of land that was made out of what looked to be a rough metal. It was very difficult to tell what kind, or if it even was metal, but that was the best way to describe it. As the probes continued to explore their respective areas, there was something that became quite apparent. The only creatures that seemed to live down there were the silver tadpoles. Aside from the individuals following the probes, these things were everywhere, on every corner of the moon, just swimming around all over the place. It was very odd how there wasn't a more diverse ecosystem, that these guys didn't have any kind of predator or prey. The first animal life on this world, perhaps? But if that was the case, how did they evolve into such complex beings without any kind of diversity? What was also noteworthy was the fact that very few of them actually got close to the ocean floor. In fact, most of them seemed to be avoiding it at all cost, as if it were something to be afraid of. I started to get a very bad feeling, like we were interfering with something that should have been just left alone. Unfortunately, there was nothing we could do. Like I said, the probes had long since done everything shown on screen, so even if we sent a signal for them to stop, it probably wouldn't have reached them until it was too late. Probe 3's AI decided it should pick a sample of the seaweed for analysis. They wouldn't be coming back to Earth, but if we could get a high-quality picture of it, we would potentially be able to analyze its possible biology. It reached out its mechanical arms through the seaweed on the ground, grabbed a handful with its pincers, and started to pull. To our surprise, it didn't come out of the ground, and considering the probe's strength and the seaweed's supposed similarity to Earth's sea plants, it should have come out just as easily. The probe continued to pull and tug at it, but it just wasn't coming out. Suddenly, the silver tadpole that had been following Probe 3 rushed in front of it, its tentacles rapidly shaking and trying to push it back. If I didn't know better, I would have said that it was trying to tell Probe 3 to stop. Unfortunately, this didn't register with Probe 3's AI, and it continued to tug. The tadpole was getting desperate, rapidly waving its tentacles back and forth as it pushed harder to get it to stop. And when that didn't work, it wrapped itself around the probe's arm. The 4 other tentacles stretched out and grabbed onto several other sections of its arms and seemed to be trying to pull at it. It was trying to break it off. The probe continued to pull at the seaweed, but to no avail. All of a sudden, even more tadpoles rained down from above and engulfed Probe 3 with their embrace, all pulling at different components in order to disassemble it. They were succeeding. We could just about see the sparks and electricity were starting to fly about, and the camera was beginning to break up. Probe 3 did not let go of the seaweed and continued to tug. Several people in the room irrationally yelled, "Stop!" But of course this wasn't going to work. With one final yank, just before the probe went offline, the seaweed was ripped from the ground, and with that, connection was lost. Silence dominated the room for a few moments. Then, we heard it. Rattling through the speakers came a low, bellowing sound. The best thing I could compare it to is a whale's call, but even by those standards, it was incredibly ominous. What frightened me the most was the fact that it didn't come from just one of the probe's microphones, but all three of them. All the silver tadpoles that we could see on screen stopped in their tracks and looked down towards the ocean floor. They didn't move a muscle, they just stopped and stared. The bellowing came again, the screens vibrating as it rang. Then I noticed something on Probe 1's screen. Something was glowing. The probe looked downwards to see what was once covered in seaweed was now a smooth, glowing orange surface. It wasn't all the same shade, and it seemed to get brighter as the surface went inwards. And this stretched for miles on end. Magma, perhaps. No, it couldn't be. It wasn't moving, and there was no way magma could surface this fast without us noticing. But then the colors started to move south, and before long the surface was pitch black. Everyone in the room was dumbfounded. What the hell were we looking at? But then it did something that made my blood run cold. Slowly, a mass of seaweed moved across it, covering up the black surface, and in the same amount of time, uncovered it again. It had blinked. That's when we realized that this whole time we hadn't been exploring the ocean floor. This was a single gargantuan creature. An ear-splitting screech emanated from the speakers. The structures in the background of Probe 2's camera came to life, violently waving and crashing against the moon's ice surface. The surface that the probe had been exploring rapidly lifted and crashed into it. Probe 2 was offline. Probe 4 witnessed a long, colossal mass move up into the sky, then stretched outwards. Due to its gargantuan size, we couldn't see how far it went, but after hearing an enormous crashing sound, we knew that it most certainly hit the other side of the moon. It was at this moment that we realized that Probe 3 was sitting on a giant limb. The surface beneath moved upwards. The other limb pushed the probe with it, but the speed of the movements through the water tore it apart before it could reach the other side of the moon. Probe 4 was offline. The last probe standing was Probe 1, but the uprush caused by the Gargantuan's movement had caused the probe to crash against the surface. It was barely online, but we could still just about see what was going on. The mass below was, from what we could see, constantly thrashing from side to side whilst roaring like an angry caged animal. We could now see that it had 2 eyes, but even though the probe was further away, each eye still made up the entirety of the probe's vision when they came into view. The silver tadpoles all rapidly swam toward the Gargantuan at once, but before we could see what they were going to do, it rushed forward and crushed the probe against the surface. Probe 1 was offline. Silence. Nobody said a word. I don't think anybody had even breathed for at least 5 minutes. I was overwhelmed by a mixture of emotions. Fear, confusion, dread, despair. After a long time, the administrator finally spoke, and it was a miracle that anybody could after what we had just witnessed. He told us that it was vital that we keep this incident a secret, to act as though it never happened. He explained that knowledge of this creature's existence would cause widespread panic, and that the public deserves to be protected from the horror that resides within our solar system. Several members of the team were driven to madness and were committed to mental hospitals. Many even committed suicide. I guess the knowledge that something like this exists is just too much to bear for some. Hell, I'm surprised I've kept my sanity from all of this. but I believe the public has a right to this information. It's the only way we can prepare for the worst should it happen. I'm still not sure what the Gargantuan is and how it got there, but my main theory is that Europa is a prison that was created for it, and the silver tadpoles are something like guards. It would make sense as to why they were following the probes around and trying to stop them from pulling at the fur. All I can say is this: Europa is still there. It hasn't cracked open or disappeared, so it's safe to say that the Gargantuan is still inside of it. Hopefully the tadpoles managed to subdue it. Even so, everyone needs to be prepared if this thing escapes its cage. Because if this thing gets out, I have no idea what this will mean for us. Be prepared.